The D-Day invasion, launched on June 6, 1944, is the largest and most complex attack in the history of humankind. The Supreme Allied Commander was Dwight Eisenhower, whose job it was to oversee all the various elements of the attack. The entire operation was nicknamed Operation Overlord, which suggests to you, appropriately enough, that there were many kind of smaller operations going on within this one large operation of Overlord. There were different naval operations. There were the paratroopers and gliders that were supposed to drop the paratroopers behind enemy lines up on the top of the cliffs. There were the operations to bombard the German defenses on the cliffs, launching artillery and other kinds of weapons. There was the amphibious attack itself, which you see on the screen, the process of getting the troops from the sea onto the shores. And then there were the support operations that were going to be coming in once a foothold was established on the beaches. So there were many different elements to this massive attack. This is also one of the most written about events in all of human history. Hundreds and hundreds of books have been written about D-Day, and in all likelihood you know something about this attack already. So I'll introduce a few points that may or may not be familiar to you without necessarily overdoing it. One of the interesting elements of this attack was the role played by the weather. There are many moments in world history when the weather plays a key role, and this was certainly one of them. In fact, I believe it's on the Weather Channel that a show started up a few years ago that was called When Weather Changed History. And the very first episode of that program related to D-Day and the weather. It came into play in two significant ways. One of them was the tides. In order to launch the attack in the best possible way, the tides had to be just right to get the men as far up the beaches as they could. And so, if you know anything about the tides, they change a little bit from day to day, and then over the course of about a month, they depend on the moon, the tides kind of cycle back around. In other words, there were only a few days each month when the tides were right to potentially launch this attack. And so those days rolled around in April, and the tides, the weather was not good. The tides were not ideal. And then in May, those days are there, and then the weather is not good. And in June, there are a few days when the tides are right, and once again, the weather is not ideal. And so this is the other aspect of the weather, simply the weather itself. It was stormy, it was windy, it was very choppy, and the weather was not clear. And with so many different operations trying to be coordinated, the weather could really wreak havoc with their plans. And so, as I mentioned, in June, this little window of opportunity comes around when they could launch the attack, and the weather was bad again. It was rainy, it was windy, visibility was poor. But there was just a brief kind of break in the weather on June 6th, and Eisenhower determined that we're going to launch this attack. And so, June 6th, 1944, they launched the D-Day invasion. The weather was still not good. Visibility was poor. It was windier than expected, and so many of the paratroopers who dropped up behind enemy lines were scattered all over the place, and very few of the operations worked as well as the Allies might have hoped. Another of the operations that went on within Operation Overlord was a misdirection campaign, an attempt to fool the Germans into thinking that the attack was going to come somewhere else. And the site or the target of this misdirection campaign is known as the Pas de Calais or the Calais Pass. And if you look in the very top corner of the screen, there's a map. That's a map of France. And the red area up at the top is Calais. It's the point where the English Channel is at its narrowest. And so it's a logical site, potentially, for this attack to come. That was the place that the Allies were directing this misdirection campaign. They wanted to convince the Germans that it was where the attack was coming, when really the attack was going to be directed at Normandy. And so the Allies massed a fake army in the southeast corner of England, so that when planes flew over, it looked like there were massive numbers of tanks and planes and other kind of items there, when most of them were just made out of wood, or they were painted on the ground to look like they were there. They also sent a dead body floating across the English Channel, loaded with papers that indicated that this was where the attack was coming. And sure enough, the Germans found that body, found those papers, and were convinced. Hitler, even when the D-Day invasion started at Normandy, Hitler was convinced that that was a fake attack and that the real one was coming in Calais. And so he held back from sending reinforcements to the Normandy beaches until it was, in fact, too late. Now, there were 5 beaches in Normandy, and so there were 5 different attacks going on, each with its own flavor and its own characteristics. I'm going to show you a map on the next slide and talk about it a little bit more. But the most famous of the beaches is Omaha Beach. That is where most of the books have been written, and a lot of the recollections that we have derived from that attack, partly because that is where the fighting was harshest, and partly because all of the troops at Omaha Beach were American. Here's a picture from your textbook that gives you a sense of what it might have been like to be part of that invasion of Normandy. You get a sense from the sort of blurred nature that it was very chaotic, very dangerous. The soldier on the screen, you can't make out much detail, but there's a sense of kind of being dazed and confused and frightened. I would also recommend to you that if you haven't seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, that you check that out, and if not the whole film, perhaps just the early minutes of the film. The first 20 or 25 minutes are, I think, the best and most accurate depiction of what the invasion of Normandy might have been like. It's a fantastic film on the whole if you've never seen it, but some of those early scenes are available on YouTube and give you a great sense of what the invasion itself was like. And this is a map. While it's a little bit primitive, it gives you a better sense of the 5 different beaches, and in some ways the extent of the nature of this attack. If you look in the far upper right-hand corner of this map, that is where Calais is. That was where the misdirection campaign took place. So the Normandy beaches are a little bit farther down to the south. It's a little bit farther distance across the English Channel. And you also see the 5 beaches there, with Omaha being second from the left. Notice also that there were follow-up forces swinging around. This was a massive, massive invasion. Once the Allied forces had gained a toehold on the beaches, there were follow-up forces, hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of ships, bringing more men, more supplies, and sending them onto the shore to complete this invasion of Europe. So the fighting was extremely harsh. The Germans had heavily defended the beaches and the cliffs that overlooked the beaches. Much of Operation Overlord did not go as planned. The attempts to bomb and to attack the German defenses had little effect. The paratroopers, as I mentioned, were sort of blown in all different directions. And yet, the Allies managed to gain a toehold. They managed to get ashore, and from that point forward, it becomes a process of driving back the Germans slowly, bit by bit, across the French countryside and closer to Germany itself. I think in our minds it's easy to kind of skip over the next year of combat. After D-Day, we have read and heard so much about the attack at D-Day, and then it would seem that Berlin fell the next day. But it wasn't the case. The months after D-Day involved incredibly harsh and difficult fighting. As the Allied forces made their way across the northern parts of France, much of that country is farming country, and the different farmers over the centuries had divided their farms one from another by very, very dense rows of underbrush and bushes called hedgerows, or with stone walls. Each one of these, and they might only be a few hundred yards apart from each other, each one made for a ready-made defensive position for the German forces as they were driven back. And so each one of these hedgerows presented a different battle, a different conquest to be taken, and the Germans could fall back 100 yards and defend the next one. And so it took months for the Allies to make their way across northern Europe, gradually closing in on Germany itself. Eventually, by December 1944, so this is 6 months or so after the D-Day invasion, the Allies were closing in on the border with Germany itself. Hitler and the Germans, getting more and more desperate, decided to launch one last desperate attack, one last offensive, which came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, also known as the Battle in the Ardennes, from December 1944 to January of 1945. Hitler committed all of his reserve forces to this attack and actually pulled many of his forces from the Eastern Front against Russia, pulled them to the west to engage in this attack. For a time, it succeeded in breaking through the Allied line and driving out into the countryside, creating what you see in the picture there, this bulge in the battle line. And so that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies, for a time, were thrown into disarray. The weather was terrible during this time. You see the picture at the top. It was extremely cold, lots of snow, and the Allied forces were kind of divided up from each other for a time. Eventually, though, they regrouped, regained their momentum. They were able to push back against this German attack, restore that bulge, kind of push the bulge back in the line. And this was really the last great German offensive. After the failure of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were in full defensive mode. What follows over the next several months is what some historians refer to as the race to Berlin. The British and American forces are driving to the east towards Berlin. The Russian forces are closing in from the east to the west. They are closing in on Berlin. And so the two sides are kind of racing to see who's going to get there first. At this point, I want to plant a seed that we're going to come back to and discuss again in the next chapter, the Cold War. But as we are reaching this final stage in World War II itself, both sides are already beginning to transition their thinking to the next phase of what the world is going to look like, what becomes the Cold War. There is something of an understanding, whether it's written or not, that the Russians will be allowed to keep as much territory as the Red Army conquers during this phase. And so it is the Russians and the Red Army from the east who are really racing to Berlin. They are going at full speed. Coming from the west, the American and British forces are moving more carefully, more slowly, They are also slowed down during this period because along the way they are uncovering the concentration camps, and they are, rather than just breezing past them on their way to Berlin, they have to stop and try to take care of the people and to liberate the concentration camps cautiously. And so it is the Russians who win the race to Berlin. It is Russian forces that conquer Berlin, in a sense achieving this final victory over the Germans, and the Red Army pushes even further out into the countryside. With the fall of Berlin, it is only a matter of days before victory in Europe is declared. And yet victory in Europe brings with it mixed emotions. A number of things happening that prevent the Allied troops from fully celebrating. On April 12, 1945, the President of the United States, FDR, died. He had been president for 12 years. Many Americans couldn't remember a time when another man was president. Harry Truman, who assumed the presidency, we will discuss his presidency at some length later. He's generally regarded as a pretty good president, but he had enormous shoes to fill. Just a few weeks later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and thus brought to an end this parallel between FDR and Hitler. With Hitler's death, the last clinging hopes of victory died as well, and so it only took a few days for the Germans to surrender. On May 8th, 1945, this is Victory in Europe Day. One of the other things that created some pause among the Allied troops, even as they made their way to victory, was the revelation of the concentration camps, the horrifying discovery of warehouses filled with victims' clothing, piles of victims' hair, gold fillings from the victims' teeth, and all of these terrible things. All of the rumors about the concentration camps were proven to be true. And a final thing that gave pause to the Allies, even as they achieved victory in Europe, was that many of those same troops were immediately sent to the Pacific, where they engaged in combat to defeat Japan.